Would you bow with me? Lord, as we have already sang this morning, we invite you to take our life. We invite you to take our heart. Lord, I know this morning that as we have all come into this sanctuary, that we can keep no secrets from you. You know us. You know our hearts. You know those things that are weighing us down this morning. You know those burdens that we've brought with us here. Father, maybe we're struggling in relationships. Maybe we're just struggling in our walk with you. And we believe this morning that as we have sung and as we have encountered you through our singing, I pray that you would make our heart moldable, shape us, and make us teachable. We commit this to you, Lord. In your name we pray. Amen. Well, I can't imagine that it would have been easy being the Apostle Paul's friend and traveling companion. We all know that he lived a very hard and at times a very dangerous life, and although there were circles in which Paul was revered, there were also those circles who would have been just as happy if Paul had gone away permanently. We find this man to be a plague, they said, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world. He's the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, as one paraphrase of Acts 24 puts it. It's true that Paul had this uncanny way of polarizing people. And one of those groups, especially the Jewish religious community, even went so far as to press false charges against him, which landed him behind bars, a place where most of them and others would have been happy to have seen him rot. So my question to you this morning is, what kind of adrenaline junkie hangs around or befriends a guy like Paul? Who would have dared to accompany him as he traveled and preached, or even spent time visiting him in prison? Well, that individual is the hero that we want to look at this morning, and his name was Luke. Luke was quite a character. I would venture to guess that there were few as fearless as Paul's friend and trusted traveling companion. Well, we really don't know a lot about him, about Luke, and many have been curious as to just exactly who he was, because as you read through the New Testament, his impact is obvious. Although there's a lot that we don't know about him, there are some things that we do know. Firstly, many scholars now believe that he was in fact a Gentile. In fact, Luke appears to have been one of those first early Gentile converts to Christianity. To give you a bit of a reminder of church history, the early church was predominantly Jewish. But as we read through the book of Acts, it records that over time, Gentiles or non-Jews came to accept the message of the apostles and became members of the church that Jesus founded. So firstly, we know that he was a Gentile. Secondly, we know that Luke was a very well-educated man. In fact, among other things, he was a linguist. He spoke and wrote classical Greek, but he could also converse and write in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Hellenistic Greek. His mastery of Greek has led a lot of people to believe that he was probably Greek by heritage. It's interesting to note that Luke is the only Gentile writer of the New Testament. And as we know, he wrote the Gospel of Luke, and then he wrote the sequel, the book of Acts. So he wrote about both Jesus' life and the implications of Jesus' life as the church began to grow and take shape. Luke concludes his gospel with the resurrected Christ and begins the book of Acts with that same Jesus. So we know that he was a Gentile. We know that he was well educated, but we also know from Scripture that Luke was a physician. I love the way Paul describes Luke in Colossians 4. He writes, "Our dear friend Luke, the doctor," or as the King James puts it, the beloved physician. Now, a physician in Luke's day was not the same as a modern physician. As you can imagine, the science of medicine was certainly not as advanced. But even so, the Greeks were head and shoulders above other Gentiles when it came to the the science and medicine and understanding of the working of the human body. A physician in Luke's day could work with body and mind, though not in the same sense that a modern doctor would. But Luke was interested in people's well-being. And that's one of the things as you read the Gospel of Luke and as you read Acts, it's obvious that Luke cared for people, not just physically, but spiritually as well. You know, this is some of what we know about Luke, but there's other things that we can come to understand about Luke, both by how he writes, but also by how Paul writes of him, or Paul speaks of him. You know, when we think about heroes, I would venture to guess that Luke probably doesn't come quickly to mind. But if we're looking at individuals to pattern our lives after, individuals who were faithful and loyal, individuals who were passionate, and individuals who embraced a love for people like Jesus taught, then I'd suggest to you that Luke really does need to be right up there. He was certainly not the kind of hero that would burst in and save the day. He wasn't the kind that would gravitate towards the stage or seek the limelight. But Luke knew who he was. He understood what he could offer. He served his friends, his faith, and a cause that he was passionate about with every ounce of who he was. I want to suggest to you this morning that there are some very profound lessons that we can take from what we know of Luke. And one of those things that his life reminds us of is that heroes are more often first knights than kings. You know, when we think of knights, whether it be King Arthur's or even Roman soldiers, we often think of these great armored leaders on horseback swinging these huge swords. But you know, the root of the word actually is connected to the Old English word meaning page boy or simple boy. During the Middle Ages, the church actually became involved in knighting young boys and men. And there was an emphasis first and foremost on the development of character. First and foremost in that was teaching them about the need to fear God. They were also taught to show mercy, especially towards the poor and oppressed. They were taught to be humble, and they were taught about honor and sacrifice and courage. First and foremost, they were chosen to be servants of the people. It wasn't about a high position of prominence, as we sometimes think. It was about sacrifice, and it was about servanthood. You know, we watch the movies and read the books, and I think so often embrace those characters that end up in positions of power, don't we? I mean, we watch Aragorn, and we follow him in Lord of the Rings and watch him move from a ranger to eventually becoming the king. You know, we follow the kids in the Chronicles of Narnia, moving from being somewhat of a dysfunctional family to a place where they become a king and a queen and a prince and a princess. We follow Will Smith in the movie The Pursuit of Happiness, him moving from being a homeless man with his son to being an upper executive in a large investment firm. I mean, part of what makes a story great is watching somebody scratch and claw their way from a place of having nothing to a place of predominance, right? But you know, maybe it's time for us to take a bit of a Hollywood reality check. Because Jesus reminds us often that being a hero in his kingdom has more to do with how we treat the poor, how we love our neighbor, how we feed the hungry, and how we tangibly care for the widow than it does about some lofty position. Jesus says in Matthew 25, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did it for me." What was he talking about? Well, earlier he was referring to those who were hungry and thirsty, or a stranger, or those who need clothes, or those who were sick, or those who were in prison. Jesus at this time is speaking to a large crowd of his followers, as well as a large group of Jewish religious leaders when he makes these statements. And part of what he's trying to help the people to understand was that the religious community had tried to convince them that favor with God was about jockeying for position. It was about leveraging influence. It was about creating both an insider and an outsider mentality. If you did certain things, then you were in. But if you didn't do those things, or for whatever reason couldn't do those things, well, then you were shunned by God. But in this new kingdom that he was coming to create, that he talked so much about, it was very different than that. He was looking for a very different kind of hero. Being a hero in this new kingdom was about action, and it was about serving, and it was not about entitlement and a high position. I'd suggest to you that everything we know about Luke points to the fact that he understood this, he embraced it, and he truly lived it out in his life. You know, one of the incredible things that Luke is known for was that he willingly stayed beside Paul day in and day out for at least 2 years while Paul was imprisoned in Rome. You know, Paul and Luke both knew that God had chosen Paul to witness before Caesar in Rome. So there Paul was, just sitting there in prison. I don't know how many of you have ever had the experience of extended times of just sitting there. But there's times when you feel like you're literally going crazy. I mean, maybe it's an extended hospital stay, or you're sick at home. Maybe you're unemployed and looking for a job. But during those times, on a human level, it is very easy for us to lose perspective. Now, I don't know if Paul ever had moments of feeling like that. It's recorded that God used Paul's imprisonment to accomplish some incredible things. But what we do know is that God used Luke to provide care, encouragement, and support to Paul during that time in prison. I mean, I can just imagine every day Luke walked past the Roman guards who were guarding Paul, and they must have thought that he was crazy for day in and day out going and visiting him. If you've ever wanted proof that doctors at one point did make house calls, well, there is your proof. You know, in my job, I often meet people who I think act like Luke did towards Paul, who, as God defines heroes, they would be the heroes. It's the spouse that every day goes and visits their loved one in the hospital or nursing home or cares for them at home. It's the Stephen minister who selflessly gives of their time to disciple someone back to wholeness. It's those from City Connections that go and meet new immigrant families at the airport. It's the support group leaders that patiently and lovingly walk with people through the painful seasons in their lives. We're told that Luke went day in and day out to visit Paul, caring for him, encouraging him, and I'm sure on more than one occasion bringing to him a reminder of the bigger picture as to why he was there. You know, as we read earlier, Paul refers to Luke as his beloved physician in Colossians 4. And the word beloved in that passage is written. It's such a complicated word in the original language, and it carries with it this sense of, I don't know if I could have done it without you. I wonder if you've ever had anyone in your life that has been like that. Or I wonder if you've ever seized the opportunity to be that for somebody else. This is what a hero in God's kingdom looks like. Heroes are oftentimes first knights rather than kings. Well, heroes also understand the value and significance of simple obedience. You know, Luke was very comfortable sitting in the back seat, wasn't he? Now, I don't know about you, but for those of us who are seasoned drivers, we sometimes have a hard time sitting in the back seat, don't we? Especially when we think we know better than the driver how to get to the destination. But Luke was very comfortable sitting in the back seat. He knew who he was, and he knew what he had to offer, and he wanted to focus on that rather than what he wasn't. We know that Luke had a clear picture of what he needed